America has always admired power when it shines. Wealth, influence, and visibility are treated as proof of worth, as if money itself were a moral achievement. In this landscape, success is not only earned but displayed, measured by how loudly it can announce itself. The richer the individual, the larger the stage built around them. Cameras linger, headlines praise, and public imagination fills in the gaps with reverence. Power becomes something to watch, not question. Within this culture, billionaires are elevated beyond entrepreneurs. They are framed as visionaries, saviors, and cultural milestones. Their stories are repeated until they feel inevitable, stripped of uncertainty and doubt. Media narratives polish struggle into inspiration, transforming complicated lives into simple legends. The audience is invited to applaud without asking what the performance costs or who pays for the lights to stay on. Serafina Cole emerged into this world at precisely the right moment. A self-made black billionaire, her rise was celebrated as more than personal success. It was framed as national progress, proof that barriers had finally fallen. She became a symbol before she could fully remain a person. Every interview, every public appearance, every charitable gesture reinforced the same message: Serafina Cole was untouchable, a living testament to possibility. Her public image was carefully constructed and flawlessly maintained. She spoke with confidence that sounded effortless, as though doubt had never visited her. Philanthropic foundations carried her name, reinforcing the idea that her wealth was not only vast but virtuous. Business magazines described her as disciplined, fearless, and visionary. Political leaders sought her approval. Communities praised her generosity. From the outside, her power appeared absolute. Yet power, when examined closely, often depends less on control and more on perception. Serafina's authority did not come from physical force or direct command, but from belief. People believed she was inevitable, and so they treated her as such. They believed she was benevolent, and so they trusted her decisions. They believed her success represented fairness, and so they ignored the discomfort beneath that belief. Power, in her case, functioned like theater. Every move was watched. Every success required an audience. The admiration surrounding her carried a quiet tension. The more she was praised, the less space remained for vulnerability. Any admission of uncertainty risked cracking the image she had been elevated to represent. Over time, her confidence hardened into something else. Not cruelty, but distance. Not arrogance, but insulation. The higher the platform, the harder it became to hear anything other than applause. Subtle signs of fragility existed, though few noticed them. Decisions were increasingly framed for optics rather than impact. Public statements sounded rehearsed, polished to avoid discomfort. Philanthropy became symbolic, favoring visibility over depth. None of this appeared alarming on its own. In fact, it was rewarded. The audience prefers clean narratives. Complexity disrupts enjoyment. Serafina understood this, even if she rarely acknowledged it. She knew her power lived in perception. She knew that influence required constant maintenance. To remain admired, she had to remain impressive. To remain impressive, she had to remain distant. Control, in this sense, was not about dominance but about choreography. Every step had to land perfectly, every gesture timed to applause. But theater has a weakness. It depends entirely on the audience. Without belief, the performance collapses. Without applause, the illusion fades. Power that cannot exist without being seen is never fully secure. It must constantly prove itself, constantly reassure the crowd that it deserves the spotlight. At the height of her influence, Serafina Cole looked unbreakable. Her name carried weight. Her presence commanded attention. Her success story felt complete. Yet beneath the surface, her power rested on something fragile and temporary: public belief. And belief, once shaken, does not easily return. Power often looks strongest just before it fractures. The stage lights shine brightest moments before they flicker. Serafina stood at the center of the stage, unaware that somewhere beyond the applause, unseen forces were beginning to shift. The question was no longer how powerful she was, but how long the audience would keep watching. Serafina Cole's rise did not begin with inspiration, it began with restraint. Her childhood was shaped by careful decisions made in quiet rooms, where resources were limited and mistakes carried lasting consequences. Scarcity taught her awareness early. She learned to observe patterns, to notice who was listened to and who was ignored, to understand that comfort was not promised but negotiated. Ambition for her was not about excess. It was about insulation from uncertainty. From an early age, Serafina developed a disciplined focus that set her apart. While others chased opportunity broadly, she narrowed her attention with precision. Education was not a dream but a strategy. She studied systems the way others studied stories, learning where power gathered and how it protected itself. In rooms where she felt unseen, she compensated with preparation. In spaces where she was underestimated, she responded with quiet dominance. As she entered professional environments, her presence unsettled expectations. She did not match the image of authority those spaces were accustomed to. This disconnect created friction, but it also sharpened her instincts. She spoke carefully, revealed little, and treated every advancement as provisional. Trust was earned slowly, if at all. Survival required control, and control required distance. Her ascent was steady rather than spectacular. She positioned herself within industries that rewarded foresight over charisma, leveraging insight where others relied on momentum. Each success reinforced her belief that visibility was dangerous unless managed. She avoided unnecessary attention, understanding that scrutiny rarely arrives without cost. Yet success attracts its own gravity, and eventually, the spotlight found her. The narrative formed quickly once it began. Media outlets framed her story as exceptional, then symbolic, then historic. She was celebrated not only for what she achieved, but for what she represented. Her identity expanded beyond individual accomplishment into collective meaning. She became evidence, reassurance, proof that progress was real. With each headline, the distance between who she was and who she was expected to be widened. Becoming the first came with invisible weight. Mistakes felt amplified, successes scrutinized for purity. There was no room for ambiguity. She learned that symbols are not allowed to be conflicted. They must be decisive, confident, and unshakable. To survive this expectation, Serafina refined her emotional armor. Vulnerability was minimized. Empathy was rationed. Control became instinctual. What once protected her began to define her. Survival instincts evolved into management strategies. Relationships were filtered through risk assessment. Loyalty was valued, but transparency felt threatening. The more power she gained, the fewer people challenged her perspective. Admiration replaced honesty. Silence replaced disagreement. Public dominance grew alongside private isolation. The loneliness was not dramatic, it was structural. There were no true peers, only observers and beneficiaries. Those who admired her saw an icon, not a person. Those who worked with her adapted their behavior, careful not to disrupt the image. Even generosity became performative, shaped by optics rather than connection. She understood this dynamic but felt powerless to escape it without jeopardizing everything she had built. Emotionally, the cost accumulated quietly. Her sense of self blurred into her reputation. Decisions were weighed not only by outcome but by narrative impact. She measured her words, her presence, her absence. The performance of certainty became habitual, leaving little space for doubt. Confidence was no longer a feeling but a requirement. Becoming a symbol often means losing the self. Serafina's humanity was compressed into a story others could consume. Complexity was edited out. The world needed her to be consistent, inspirational, and controlled. She complied because deviation felt dangerous. The performance sustained her power, but it also eroded her interior life, yet beneath the image, feeling persisted. Symbols are not supposed to feel, but Serafina did. She felt the strain of expectation, the isolation of success, the quiet fear that without the narrative, her place would dissolve. Power had given her influence, but it had also narrowed her world. The question she avoided was the one that mattered most. If the symbol begins to feel, if the armor weakens even slightly, what happens when the world notices? Serafina Cole's authority did not operate quietly. It moved through rooms with intention, framed by carefully chosen moments and amplified by visibility. Power in her world was never just exercised, it was displayed. Decisions were accompanied by announcements, initiatives by ceremonies, and leadership by carefully staged appearances. Control, she understood, felt more secure when it was seen. Corporate life under her influence became theatrical by design. Product launches, restructuring decisions, and partnerships were presented as moments of vision rather than calculation. Language was polished, imagery deliberate. The goal was not deception but dominance of narrative. If the story was told first and told well, questions arrived softened. The audience consumed meaning before they had time to doubt it. Philanthropy played a similar role. Giving was never careless. It was aligned with timing, visibility, and message. Causes were selected not only for impact but for resonance. Each contribution reinforced a story of benevolence and responsibility. Generosity became a mirror reflecting back the image she needed the public to see. The distinction between intention and presentation blurred, not because she lacked concern, but because perception had become inseparable from power. Media partnerships strengthened this dynamic. Access was selective. Interviews were structured. Narratives were reinforced through repetition. Over time, her presence in public discourse felt consistent, almost curated to the point of inevitability. Critics existed, but they rarely shaped the dominant story. The show moved forward smoothly, supported by alignment between influence and amplification. Fear and loyalty operated quietly beneath the surface. Fear did not come from threats, but from exclusion. Access to Serafina's world meant proximity to opportunity. Loyalty was rewarded with stability and silence. Dissent was not punished loudly, it was simply edged out. This created an environment where disagreement faded before it could form. Control functioned best when no one felt they were being controlled. Yet maintaining this performance required constant attention. Every public move needed calibration. Every silence risked misinterpretation. The pressure beneath the polished surface was persistent. Authority depended on momentum, and momentum depended on engagement. Applause was not optional, it was structural. Without it, the illusion weakened. Privately, Serafina felt the weight of this dependence. Power that requires an audience is never at rest. Even moments of quiet carried risk. Absence could be read as retreat. Ambiguity could invite speculation. She learned to remain present, visible, relevant. Stillness felt dangerous. Silence felt like surrender. The show demanded energy, and energy demanded distance. Emotional engagement with outcomes became abstract. Consequences were managed through language rather than proximity. Complexity was smoothed over for clarity. In doing so, she protected the image, but narrowed her perspective. Control remained intact, but awareness dulled. What made the performance effective was also what made it fragile. It relied on trust that was broad but shallow. Most observers saw only what was presented to them. They consumed the narrative without examining its structure. But shows are never watched equally. Some viewers pay attention to the seams, the pauses, the moments where timing slips. Subtle cracks began as inconsistencies rather than failures. Decisions that felt rushed. Statements that sounded rehearsed but hollow. Philanthropic gestures that landed without resonance. None of it threatened collapse on its own. The audience still applauded. The lights remained bright. But beneath the surface, alignment weakened. Power that needs applause fears silence. The danger was not opposition, but indifference. Not outrage, but disengagement. The show could survive criticism, but not disinterest. Serafina sensed this intuitively, even if she refused to acknowledge it directly. The need to perform intensified as the possibility of quiet grew closer. Somewhere beyond the main stage, attention shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but perceptibly. A few observers stopped watching the spectacle and started watching the structure. They noticed what was missing as much as what was shown. They asked questions that did not fit the script. The show continued, but something had changed. Control remained, yet it felt tighter, more deliberate. Performances grew more precise, less forgiving. The effort to maintain dominance increased, even as certainty decreased. The question was no longer whether the show was convincing, but whether anyone was watching closely enough to see where it might break. Far from the lights that followed Serafina Cole, another America existed without ceremony or audience. It was an America where days passed unnoticed and lives unfolded without documentation. Malik Turner and Ali Brooks grew up in this space, shaped not by ambition but by constraint. Their world was not defined by choice, but by the limits imposed on them long before they could understand what choice meant. Their neighborhood did not announce itself as broken. It simply lacked investment. Buildings aged without repair. Schools functioned as holding spaces rather than gateways. Opportunity appeared briefly, then disappeared without explanation. Nothing dramatic marked the absence of support. It was quiet, normalized, and therefore invisible. Neglect became the background noise of daily life. Malik learned early that attention was something other people received. His intelligence was evident, but rarely cultivated. Teachers rotated. Programs vanished. Encouragement was inconsistent. He adapted by lowering expectations not out of laziness, but as a form of self-protection. Hope, when repeated and unfulfilled, becomes painful. Malik learned to conserve it. Eli approached survival differently. Where Malik withdrew, Eli observed. He paid attention to patterns, to which rules mattered and which were selectively enforced. He noticed how systems moved around people like him without acknowledging them. He did not resent this invisibility, he learned to use it. When no one expects anything, mistakes are ignored, but so is potential. Their friendship formed out of proximity rather than intention. Shared spaces, shared routines, shared understanding. They did not speak often about the future because the future felt theoretical. Conversations centered on what was immediately necessary. Getting through the day mattered more than imagining a different life. Emotional survival took precedence over ambition. The systems surrounding them did not fail loudly. They failed quietly. Forms went unanswered. Applications disappeared. Resources were promised but never delivered. There was no single moment of injustice to point to, only accumulation. Potential was not destroyed, it was eroded. Slowly enough that no one noticed. Visibility was a privilege Malik and Eli did not possess. Their struggles did not generate headlines. Their resilience was not inspirational content. They existed outside the narratives that celebrated success and progress. This absence did not make them bitter. It made them practical. They learned to measure reality as it was, not as it was advertised. Despite this, something endured. A sense of fairness sharpened by deprivation. An awareness of cause and effect learned through consequence. They understood responsibility not as a slogan, but as necessity. When systems did not protect them, they protected each other. Loyalty became currency. Consistency became trust. Their lives unfolded without witnesses. Small victories went unrecorded. Setbacks were absorbed without acknowledgement. This anonymity was both shield and burden. It allowed them to move without scrutiny, but it also meant their existence rarely influenced outcomes. Decisions made far away shaped their days without ever considering their names. Some lives are never meant to be seen, not because they lack value, but because systems are not designed to notice them. Malik and Eli did not seek attention. They sought stability. Yet stability remained elusive, and over time awareness grew. Awareness that their invisibility was not accidental. Awareness that distance from power did not mean freedom from its consequences. They did not yet know how their paths would intersect with a world far removed from theirs. They did not imagine themselves as disruptors or catalysts. But unseen lives still exert pressure. Quietly, relentlessly, and pressure, when ignored long enough, reshaped structures. The question was not whether Malik and Eli would step into the light intentionally. It was whether the light would eventually find them, and what would happen once it did. From a distance, the lives of Serafina Cole and the lives of Malik Turner and Ellie Brooks appeared unrelated, moving along separate tracks that would never meet. One world revolved around boardrooms, influence, and controlled narratives. The other revolved around survival, limited options, and quiet endurance. The illusion was convincing. Wealth and poverty were treated as different realities, insulated from one another by geography, language, and visibility. Yet beneath that illusion, the same systems connected them. Structural inequality does not announce itself. It operates through policies, investments, and priorities decided far from their consequences. Decisions made in executive spaces rarely carry faces with them. They are framed as efficiencies, optimizations, necessary adjustments. For Serafina, these decisions were strategic, often abstracted into data and forecasts. Their impact felt distant, theoretical, manageable. For Malik and Eli, those same decisions arrived as disruptions. Funding shifted. Programs disappeared. Opportunities narrowed without explanation. There was no memo, no justification offered. Life simply became harder. They did not know who made the choices that shaped their environment, only that those choices were never made with them in mind. Because an effect existed, but the source remained invisible. The tension grew not from interaction, but from alignment. Parallel lives moving under the influence of the same forces. Serafina's authority expanded as systems consolidated power upward. Malik and Eli's world contracted as resources were redirected elsewhere. Each movement felt independent, yet they were bound by the same architecture. One benefited from distance. The other paid for it. Serafina believed in separation, not out of malice but convenience. The idea that success insulated her from consequence was reinforced constantly. Her environment rewarded focus, speed, and decisiveness. Reflection slowed progress. Doubt complicated narratives. She trusted systems because they had worked for her. The distance between decision and outcome allowed confidence to flourish. Meanwhile, Malik and Eli began to notice patterns. Not the names behind them, but the repetition. Promises that faded. Support that arrived temporarily, then vanished. Authority that felt present only when enforcing limits, never when offering protection. They did not articulate this as injustice. They understood it as reality. But understanding did not erase frustration. It sharpened it. The illusion that wealth and poverty exist in separate worlds depends on denial. Denial that choices ripple outward. Denial that comfort is often built on displacement. Denial that invisibility is engineered, not accidental. Serafina did not see Malik and Eli, but she did not need to. Systems are designed to function without proximity. Distance does not prevent impact. As Serafina pushed forward, refining control and reinforcing narrative dominance, she unknowingly tightened the thread connecting her to lives like Malik's and Eli's. Each optimization reduced friction at the top while increasing it elsewhere. The system appeared stable because the strain was absorbed quietly by people without platforms. Malik and Eli did not yet know her name. They did not follow business news or cultural milestones. They felt her influence without recognizing its source. The pressure manifested as limits, as barriers that felt personal even when they were structural. This disconnect created confusion, then clarity. If no one was listening, then speaking differently might be necessary. Tension built not through confrontation, but through inevitability. Parallel lines do not meet by accident. They meet because conditions force convergence. Serafina's world demanded constant expansion. Malik and Ali's world demanded adaptation. Both were responding rationally to the environments they inhabited. Neither fully controlled the system shaping their choices. Distance creates comfort for those above, but it amplifies consequence below. The farther removed decision makers are from impact, the easier it becomes to dismiss that impact as collateral. Malik and Eli lived inside that collateral. They carried it daily, even when they could not name it. What neither side could see clearly yet was the cost of this alignment. Systems that benefit a few while straining many eventually reveal their pressure points. When they do, accountability searches for a shape. It looks for a face, a story, a moment where abstraction becomes real. The question was no longer whether these worlds would intersect. It was who would bear the cost when they finally did, and whether anyone truly controlled the system that made the collision inevitable. The first disruption in Serafina Cole's world did not arrive as a scandal. It did not announce itself with outrage or collapse. It arrived quietly, disguised as a rational decision made under pressure. In her world, efficiency was often framed as responsibility. Speed was equated with leadership. Deliberation, when it slowed outcomes, was treated as weakness. The decision followed that logic precisely. It was justified through numbers and projections, presented as necessary alignment rather than choice. The language surrounding it was clean, professional, and distant. Impact was measured in percentages, not people. The outcome was framed as unavoidable, a temporary discomfort in service of long-term stability. Serafina approved it without hesitation, confident in the structure that had rewarded her judgment before. The collateral damage did not register immediately. It rarely does. Consequences moved slowly at first, filtered through layers of administration and distance. Reports framed disruption as manageable. Complaints were categorized as noise. Early signs were noted, then deprioritized. Nothing appeared urgent enough to challenge momentum. Within the system, discomfort was normalized. Teams adjusted. Language softened. Loss was reframed as transition. The decision continued to function as intended on paper, and paper had always been where Serafina felt safest. The abstraction allowed her to maintain certainty. If the metrics held, the choice remained correct, but cracks do not announce themselves through failure alone. They reveal themselves through misalignment. Messages began to require clarification. Timelines slipped without explanation. Outcomes felt thinner than projected. Small inconsistencies emerged, not dramatic enough to demand attention, but persistent enough to create unease. The stage remained intact, but the performance required more effort. Serafina sensed the shift before she acknowledged it. Control felt tighter, less fluid. The confidence that once moved effortlessly now needed reinforcement. She doubled down on visibility, reinforcing narrative clarity. Public statements emphasized stability. Partnerships were highlighted. The show adapted to protect itself. What was dismissed internally as acceptable loss began to surface externally as discomfort. Not outrage, but concern. Not rebellion, but questioning. The audience did not turn away, but some stopped applauding. Silence appeared in places where affirmation once lived. For a structure built on engagement, that silence felt heavier than criticism. Early warnings were present, but they were inconvenient. Addressing them required slowing down, revisiting assumptions, acknowledging complexity. That kind of pause threatened the image of decisiveness that sustained Serafina's authority. She chose continuity over correction, believing that momentum would smooth the edges. It always had before. Power rarely collapses loudly. It leaks. It escapes through overlooked details, unaddressed consequences, rationalizations repeated too often. The crack widened subtly, invisible to those watching casually, but obvious to those paying attention to strain. The stage lights remained bright, but the floor beneath them shifted. Serafina responded with control. Messaging tightened. Access narrowed. Dissent was reframed as misunderstanding. These measures stabilized the surface but deepened the fracture beneath. The effort to hide the crack became part of the performance, adding weight to an already strained structure. For the first time, the distance between decision and consequence felt uncomfortably short. Outcomes could no longer be contained by language alone. The system still functioned, but trust thinned. The illusion of permanence weakened, Replaced by the awareness that stability required constant defense, the crack did not threaten immediate collapse. That was not its danger. Its danger lay in visibility. Once noticed, it invited scrutiny. Once acknowledged, it demanded response. And response risked exposure. The question shifted from whether the decision had been right to whether the damage could remain unseen. Control, once absolute in appearance, now felt provisional. Serafina stood at the center of the stage, aware that the performance had changed, even if the audience had not fully realized it yet. The crack existed. It had shape. It had history. And it was no longer entirely hidden. Once a crack appears, the challenge is not fixing it, but convincing everyone else it was never there at all. The consequences of distant decisions reached Malik Turner and Ely Brooks without warning or consent. There was no announcement explaining what had changed, no acknowledgement that anything had been taken from them. Life simply shifted. A program they relied on stopped operating. A pathway they had quietly counted on closed without explanation. Stability, already fragile, thinned further. Policy does not arrive with names attached. It arrives as absence. For Malik, it meant fewer resources in places that were already stretched thin. Support systems that once existed in limited form were quietly withdrawn. No one framed it as harm. It was described elsewhere as restructuring, as efficiency, as progress. On the ground, it felt like abandonment. Ely noticed the change before Malik did. He had learned to read patterns rather than promises. The routines that had once held began to break. Spaces that offered consistency became unpredictable. Authority appeared only to enforce boundaries, never to explain them. The message was clear even if it was never spoken. Adaptation was their responsibility. Profit and neglect rarely announced their presence as forces. They reshape lives through omission. What is not funded disappears. What is not valued erodes. Malik felt the pressure as confusion at first, then frustration. The effort required to maintain forward motion increased, while the reward diminished. It felt as though the ground beneath him was slowly tilting. Emotional resilience became necessity, not virtue. Malik learned to compress disappointment to move forward without processing loss. There was no space for reflection. Survival demanded immediacy. Ely, meanwhile, refined his awareness. He connected outcomes to decisions made elsewhere, even if the names behind them remained unknown. This clarity did not soften the impact, but it did sharpen understanding. Hardship strips away abstraction. Malik and Ely did not debate fairness in theoretical terms. They experienced it directly. When effort failed to produce stability, they questioned the structure rather than themselves. This distinction mattered. It prevented despair from turning inward. Instead, it redirected attention outward, toward systems rather than identity. Their moral clarity was not dramatic or performative. It emerged quietly, shaped by repeated exposure to imbalance. They recognized the difference between mistakes and neglect, between limitation and disregard. Pain taught them truths privilege never learns. It revealed how easily decisions are justified when consequences are invisible, and how heavy those consequences feel when they are not. Resilience did not make them unscarred. It made them alert. Malik began to resist the instinct to lower expectations. He questioned why opportunity felt conditional for some and automatic for others. Ely understood that invisibility was not protection, it was vulnerability. When no one is watching, harm goes unchallenged. Their response was not rebellion, but resolve. A shift occurred in how they carried themselves. Survival remained essential, but it was no longer passive. They began to document, to notice, to connect experiences that once felt isolated. Awareness became preparation. Endurance turned into intention. The system did not acknowledge them. It did not need to. It functioned as designed, but design does not eliminate consequence. It concentrates it. Malik and Ely lived inside that concentration, absorbing pressure meant to be diffused. Over time, pressure changes form. It hardens. It focuses. What they lacked in power, they gained in perspective. They saw how decisions made far away could alter lives without ever appearing personal. They understood that harm does not require malice. It only requires distance. This understanding did not bring comfort, but it brought clarity. Their lives were reshaped without permission, but not without response. Something had shifted internally. Survival was no longer enough. The quiet endurance that had carried them this far began to feel insufficient. Awareness demanded action, even if that action was not yet clear. The question was no longer how much they could withstand. It was what would happen when endurance turned into resolve, and whether anyone was prepared for what that resolve might uncover. The shift did not begin with outrage. It began with curiosity. A question raised without accusation, a headline that lingered longer than expected, a pause in the usual rhythm of praise. The public narrative surrounding Serafina Cole had always moved forward with confidence, propelled by admiration and repetition. Now it hesitated. The momentum slowed just enough for doubt to slip through. Media scrutiny intensified not because a scandal demanded it, but because alignment had weakened. Reporters began revisiting past decisions, connecting outcomes that had once seemed unrelated. Context replaced celebration. Language softened from certainty to inquiry. The story was no longer about success alone, but about impact. The audience leaned in, sensing change before fully understanding it. Serafina felt the difference immediately. Interviews became less predictable. Questions arrived layered, framed carefully but unmistakably pointed. Authority that once went unchallenged now required explanation. Her responses remained composed, precise, consistent with the image she had built. But consistency no longer reassured. It began to sound rehearsed. What unsettled her most was not criticism, but attention directed elsewhere. The spotlight, once fixed firmly on her narrative, widened. Stories surfaced that complicated the image she represented. They did not accuse her directly. They described consequences. They traced outcomes. They introduced faces that had never been part of the show. Malik Turner and Ailey Brooks entered public awareness not as protagonists, but as evidence. Their experiences were presented quietly, without spectacle. No dramatization, no exaggeration, just continuity. Their lives intersected with decisions made far away, and that intersection carried weight. The contrast between visibility and invisibility became difficult to ignore. The audience recognized something familiar in their story. Not outrage, but recognition. The realization that systems praised for efficiency often displace responsibility. The boys were not framed as victims, but as witnesses. Their existence disrupted the clean narrative without raising their voices. That restraint made the disruption more powerful. Serafina's authority was not dismantled in a single moment. It was questioned incrementally. Trust does not evaporate instantly, it thins. The applause softened. The certainty that once surrounded her choices dissolved into debate. Supporters defended her legacy, emphasizing intention and achievement. Critics focused on consequence. The conversation widened beyond her control. Every show has a moment when the crowd turns, not against the performer, but toward the truth beneath the performance. That moment is rarely dramatic. It is perceptual. The audience begins watching differently. They notice what was previously overlooked. They hear silence where there was once noise. Serafina adjusted, as she always had. Messaging tightened. Appearances were calibrated. Allies spoke on her behalf. The machine moved smoothly, but the effect had changed. The more she asserted stability, the more the question persisted beneath it. What had once felt inevitable now felt contested. The boy's story continued circulating, not because it was sensational, but because it was coherent. It explained what abstraction had hidden. It gave shape to consequence. Their anonymity had protected them once, now it lent credibility. They were not performing. They were describing reality. The fracture in the narrative widened. Not enough to collapse the structure, but enough to reveal its seams. The audience did not leave. They stayed. But they watched with altered expectations. The show no longer belonged entirely to its creator. Reputation is powerful, but it is not autonomous. It depends on belief, and belief depends on alignment between story and experience. As that alignment weakened, Serafina felt the limits of control. Influence could guide attention, but it could not erase context. The moment passed quietly, as moments of consequence often do. No declaration marked it. No verdict concluded it. But something irreversible had occurred. The audience had shifted. The narrative had widened beyond intention. The question that lingered was no longer about success or failure. It was whether reputation, built carefully over years, could outrun a truth that had finally found its witnesses. Some stories are not meant to be consumed and forgotten. They exist to stay with us, to quietly change how we see the world around us. If this story stayed with you, don't let it end here. Stories like this only keep moving when people choose to carry them forward, and staying connected is how that journey continues. When the applause fades and the stage goes dark, who truly holds the power? The one who stood in the spotlight, or the ones who lived with the consequences after it ended? Leave your answer in the comments, because sometimes the most important part of the story is what comes after it's told.